Hey everybody, Michael Tracey here. So I want to get some historical perspective for this particular discussion, and it seems a little odd to talk in terms of history here, but I think it's necessary because what's been going on is that there is a lot of myth making. There's been a concerted attempt to frame the 2016 presidential election in such a way as to absolve the Clinton campaign, the DNC, and Hillary's enablers across the party, whether that be within the party's actual infrastructure or in the media generally allied with Democrats. This narrative weaving is going on as we speak to depict the 2016 election as something that was just outside of the Clinton people's control, and that they lost because of unjust interventions by, of course, Russia and also James Comey. And the James Comey narrative has come up again in the past few days because the New York Times released a long investigation analyzing Comey's conduct over the course of the 2016 election. And it was interesting because if you look at a lot of the Clinton loyalists in the media, their reaction to this story was that the New York Times may have gotten some insight here into Comey's thinking and how he handled an unprecedented situation with the criminal investigation into Hillary's email server, and then also the beginnings of an FBI investigation pertaining to Trump's campaign associates and what kind of relations they might have had with Russian actors. And the big cry of consternation from these Democratic-aligned pundits was that the New York Times failed to adequately evaluate its own role in abetting the downfall of Hillary, because they took Comey's lead and gave undue attention to the so-called Comey Letter and what that entailed. So remember, the Comey Letter is now the shorthand term to describe a series of events which happened on October 28th of last year. James Comey sent a letter to committee chairs in Congress apprising them that the status of the Hillary Clinton email investigation had changed from active to opened. Had changed from inactive or closed to reopened and active. He had closed the investigation on July 5th of last year and gave a press conference that was sort of unusual, but was notable in that he laid out the misconduct of Hillary that didn't rise to the level of criminal liability, but was nevertheless, in his judgment, in the public interest to know about. It was closed for the remainder of the campaign until October 28th, when he reopened it because of the discovery of emails that hadn't yet been reviewed on the device of Anthony Weiner, who, by one of the most ironic coincidences of history, happened to be the estranged husband of Hillary's closest aide, Uma Abedin. But the thing is, so when liberal pundits try to, I think, process what went on in that late stage of the campaign, they were almost chronically unable to evaluate the events with any kind of objectivity, because it was nearing the climax of the campaign. Anything that happened during that period was going to be seen as very consequential in terms of determining the outcome. So they were going to basically view this through a partisan lens. But the thing is, we're now many months removed from the election, so you'd think that after some reflection and some self-criticism, these pundits would at least attempt to try to portray things a little more fair-mindedly. But instead, here's what you have Matt Iglesias complaining about in the wake of this New York Times story, which came out, I think, last Saturday. He posts a screenshot of the New York Times front page on October 29th, and he criticizes the New York Times here because obviously the front page is filled with coverage of this email matter because an FBI investigation had been reopened the previous day. So would you expect the New York Times not to cover that dramatic event with a fair amount of intensity? This was the first in American history. Remember, no major party candidate had ever been under the legal shadow, or been subject to a federal criminal investigation in the way that Hillary had. Obviously, there is some parallel there with respect to Trump, but the Trump/Russia investigation wasn't initiated until July of last year, and it was sort of a smaller scale investigation, at least initially, whereas the Hillary investigation was started in July of 2015 and then concluded the following year. So there were leaks pertaining to it all throughout the primary campaign. And one thing that I think is really inexcusable that Democrats did and their media enablers did is that when the New York Times reported in the summer of 2015 that the FBI had opened a criminal investigation, they were subject to a total avalanche of condemnation from the mainstream Democratic media organs like Media Matters, Mother Jones, and many others in the Atlantic and elsewhere, who were just totally outraged that the New York Times could be so irresponsible as to assert that there was a criminal investigation underway targeting Hillary Clinton. And to the lasting discredit of others within the New York Times, not the reporters, but editors and others, they did sort of capitulate to the pressure that was applied to them in that time period and give some kind of equivocating revision, or at least update to the story. But it turns out that the reporters, including Michael Schmidt, who broke the Hillary email story in the first place in March of 2015, they were proven 100% vindicated. There was always a criminal investigation targeting Hillary, and it had been gone on for basically the duration of the campaign. It launched in July of 2015. Now, think of this. If the Democratic Party electorate had been aware that Hillary Clinton was the subject, explicitly the subject, targeted, her conduct was targeted to assess whether she was criminally liable for felony offenses, would that have altered the perceptions of the race and perhaps led Democrats who wrongly assumed Hillary to be the safe choice or the safe bet, would that have led those voters to opt for somebody else, say like Bernie Sanders? I think that's not a totally outlandish counterfactual. But what you had was all these kind of media personalities and Democratic hacks and operatives insisting virulently that the email investigation was nothing to be concerned about. Hillary herself reiterated that as far as late as March of 2016, even when news had broken that some of her employees and underlings had gotten immunity from the Justice Department, and you don't get immunity unless there's a criminal proceeding underway. This was after this concerted campaign to characterize the Hillary investigation as a security review or a security inquiry rather than a criminal investigation, which it was. So that was an active campaign of deceit. WikiLeaks released an email in which David Kendall, who was the Clintons' longtime family lawyer, was contemplating what kind of media strategy they would employ to basically deceive the public into thinking that this was not a criminal investigation but a security review. So they were using that euphemism, which really means ultimately nothing, because the FBI assesses conduct for criminal investigation, for the purposes of determining whether federal law has been violated. So it was because of this concerted campaign of deception and propaganda that Hillary was able to, just barely beat her, crotchety old socialist challenger and secure the Democratic nomination. So I think it really needs to be emphasized that her nomination was gained on false pretenses. It was gained on the pretense that she had no real criminal problem that wouldn't pose any significant political risk. But there were people who along the way were saying, including myself, Nathan Robinson of Current Affairs, who I've had on TYT, many others were saying, whatever you think about the substance of this criminal investigation, the fact that the Democrats are just kind of mindlessly lining up to nominate somebody who, in historical terms, has legal problems that are unmatched in all of U.S. history. The fact that this is happening with such little consideration shows that the Democrats are willing to take a huge gamble on a candidate who ultimately, for reasons not related to the email investigation, is quite weak. But the email investigation was significant, and people and there were people who were saying that this is going to be a legal liability. So when people talk about the Comey Letter, they tend to talk about Comey Letter for as if it just came out of nowhere or appeared in a vacuum, when really it was just the culmination of, at that point, a year and a half of legal problems that were snowballing, in which the Democratic Party launched a concerted effort to deny or ignore. So there would have been no Comey Letter if not for the untoward practices that the Clintons employed. There would have been no Comey Letter if the Democratic Party had been honest with their party's voters and informed them that this was a real liability and needed to be perceived as such, or else it could come back to bite them in dramatic fashion, which it did just a little over a week before the election. The worst possible time for something like this to happen. So this impulse to blame Comey, or to basically heap all the responsibility for what transpired on October 28th of last year on Comey himself, rather than the constellation of actors which created the conditions where the Comey Letter was something that could ever have happened, is just this blame shifting. And this inability to grapple with reality that we still see on display in the Democratic commentariat. I don't think anybody is super interested now, given all that's going on with respect to Trump, in relitigating the Hillary Clinton email saga. But at the same time, this is real history now that's being crystallized. The mythology of today is going to be crystallized into the history of tomorrow. So if people have a warped perception of what actually happened, then the popular narrative for years to come is going to be distorted. So I think it's really an imperative to be clear-headed, clear-minded about what went on, and not just talk about the Comey Letter as if it just sort of materialized out of thin air. No, it was the pretty foreseeable byproduct of the Clintons' untoward conduct, and just reiterated that they were much more susceptible to, that they were much less a safe pick than their supporters insisted. So I wrote a Medium post about this, which I will link to, and which you can read for yourself for more information here. I know this can seem tedious, and I find it tedious as well, but I keep seeing these false narratives propagated, and if those narratives are allowed to just proliferate unchecked, then I think people are going to not be able to honestly assess their culpability in enabling the Clintons and ultimately allowing for the election of Trump. So the history is important, and I would be curious to know what you think. There's more to say on this matter. I'm not super thrilled about even having to talk about it, but I will if the need should arise. So read that piece and let me know what you think, and have a great day.